Since rugby turned professional in 1995, Ireland have gone from also-rans to Grand Slam champions.
61-year wait is over.
But of all our international rugby matches, there are some that matter more.
More than the All Blacks, more than anybody else, Ireland really want to beat England.
And sometimes, like one Saturday in Croke Park, it can transcend the game itself.
Rugby passed a test and became a national sport that day.
The ball is dead, I think.
But not all of Ireland's great teams belong to the professional era. One of our best rugby sides never laid claim to a Grand Slam or a Triple Crown.
In retrospect, it was a legendary period. They were knocking on the door all the time.
But it was also a time of chaos and bloodshed as violence swept Ireland.
This is a society which is deeply unstable. Civil war is a real prospect here.
And the Ireland team of 1972 would pay the price.
We sort of felt we were lepers, we were ostracised. We wouldn't be playing international rugby.
This is the story of the epic rugby rivalry between Ireland and England, of how Irish rugby and the Five Nations itself almost fell apart under the strain of the Northern conflict, and of one of the most moving moments in the history of Irish sport. The early 1970s was a different world. Eamon de Valera was president, Ireland was about to join the EEC, and rugby was a game played by amateurs.
We didn't receive a penny, and we didn't want to receive a penny, you know, and it just cost us money to play. We had to pay the sub for our club, right? If you played 4 internationals in the year, you got 2 jerseys free and you had to pay for the other 2.
Back then, rugby was focused on local clubs, and by 1972, these clubs had produced a new generation who were taking to the international stage.
There was the infusion of youth. Johnny Maloney, for example, had been absolutely burning it up for St Mary's as a schoolboy in the very late 60s, and then for Leinster in the early 70s, and he came into the side.
When you're at school, you never even think of being an international. I got the call in 1972 and I was absolutely delighted. But you have soon got to come down to earth and realise you've got to play a game and think about your performance. But the initial reaction was elation.
Another fresh face was a long-haired flanker named Fergus Slattery, who had taken an unorthodox path into the squad.
One of the things that I knew I had to do was stop smoking. And when I was 17, I smoked 117 cigarettes, non-tipped, 80 Lucky Strike and 37 Gold Flake. And that was in one day. So I gave up the smoking when I was 19, and I had a plan to get into the Irish team, and it worked.
When it actually happened, you were gobsmacked. You know, that it actually something happened. And then the hours turned into days, and suddenly you were on the plane and you were going to France.
Tom was one of these, most competitive men I've ever come across.
I think retrospectively, I didn't realise how lucky I was to be in such a great team with such a number of great players who were world class.
The newcomers were joining a team that had a hard core of battle-scarred veterans.
You had Ray McLaughlin at its core, both in terms of playing and strategy.
You had the absolutely extraordinary Michael Henderson Gibson, who I think was the greatest rugby player I ever saw play for Ireland. He was absolutely wonderful.
The Irish forwards were led by an imposing second row from Ulster named Willie John McBride.
I was always physically strong because I worked on the farm. I had never seen an international game until I played in one, which was amazing. I remember running out onto Twickenham, which is probably, in those days, was the biggest ground around the place, and you know, you've all these, whatever it was, 50, 60,000 people. It was quite a frightening experience.
I always had a good relationship with Willie because I was on 2 Lions tours with him, and great character, one you looked up to.
Andy Ripley called him my leader from the 74 Lions tour, and he is our leader. Great player, great man, and he was a fantastic captain in 74 because he had total respect.
I felt after that tour, I had 29 brothers, and that will never diminish. You got a letter from the rugby union saying, "Dear McBride," you know, you didn't have a Christian name in those days. "Dear McBride, I wish to advise you that you've been selected to play for Ireland. You will be provided with a pair of Irish socks, and if you lose them and require a second pair of socks during the season, it will be 17 and sixpence," which was a lot of money in those days.
When Tom Kiernan's captain, he gets a letter from the IRFU. It says, "Dear Kiernan, it has come to my attention that you had an extra sausage, right, for your breakfast, okay, on the day of the match. Could you kindly refund the IRFU 3D, right? The auditors are coming."
And you know, when you think of what they have today and the sort of scientific approach there is to even what they eat, like we were eating big steaks and potatoes and doing, you know, everything we were doing was all wrong.
Special food? No. When you played for England, you always ordered a steak because you thought it might be your last free meal. I did most of my training on the farm, lifting heavy weights, that sort of thing. When I was playing for Bristol, you had accountants, vicars, jailbirds. You had every sort playing for the club, and you always got on really well. I think the training was a bit different those days because you usually finished off with about 3 pints of Guinness, which made it worthwhile anyhow.
48 hours before the game, that's when you could meet up. So there was very little preparation in those days.
Most of the players would have gone to the pub on the Thursday night. There were definitely a few who went on the Friday night, right, on the basis that they wouldn't be able to sleep unless they had 6 pints of Guinness, right, and that's just the way it was.
I never went out drinking the night before a game, visibly. And you think you just shouldn't do. But there were a few places in Dublin I could go to where it was very quiet.
The great thing about Dublin and the Irish is the crack.
Oh, I loved it. The boys loved it going to Dublin. We always loved the Irish attitude, which was give everything you've got to win. Once the result's known, have a few beers with your mates.
I can remember quite vividly Fergus taking me under his wing and ended up going down Leeson Street. Take me up to Monto, 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 take me up to Monto.
In the early 70s, England's trips to Dublin came once every 2 years. International rugby was almost entirely limited to the Five Nations Championship between Ireland, Wales, Scotland, England and France.
The unusual thing about that team in 72, we had 5 new caps, an incredible number. And people said, 5 new caps going over to France. Mother of God, they're going to get their ass kicked, you know, and we were a bit naive. We didn't realise we hadn't won there for 20 years. I wasn't intimidated. Ignorance is bliss, I think. You know?
The French were pretty invincible in those days. They'd won several championships in the late 60s into 1970, 71, and they were at home. Away teams didn't win in Paris.
I have a terrible history in Paris, and it was always difficult to play there. I don't know why, and because we had a great record against France in Dublin. Whether the crowd plucked them up or what it was, I could never understand.
Willie John McBride, McLaughlin, then the new cap, Feary.
But Jesus, I'll tell you, Tom Kiernan was given the team talk before we were out on the pitch.
Now here's a chance for Tom Kiernan.
He frightened the bejesus off me. You know, the spit coming out of his mouth, the fire and fury, you know. And you were saying to yourself, oh, geez, I hope he doesn't see me, right? Doesn't pick on me. You know, to be honest, it was nearly a relief to get out the door of the dressing room to get onto the pitch.
This is Ireland attacking. To Mike Gibson. Beautiful ball that. Grace with a chance. Nicely into Mike Gibson. Great stuff. That was McGann eventually. Ireland now doing magnificently.
Johnny Maloney had a dream game at scrum half anyway, and he was a fine player. And Johnny's great strength was that he could run into gaps, and he had pace to burn.
9 for Ireland, John Maloney.
After about 8 minutes, I went in for the try. Just did a dummy and saw there was a little gap and went straight through.
Barry McGann poised and waiting. The pickup by number 8 forward Hickey. 2 yards from the line. Beautiful try, what a score! That was absolutely brilliant.
You don't think. If you have time to think, you're gone. So it's purely instinctive.
John Maloney in his first international. What a moment for this little fellow.
My abiding memory of the French game is Ray McLaughlin taking a ball from the maul about 20 metres out. Now, props in those days didn't score tries. If they did, it was from a range of maybe 2 metres max. But Ray took this ball from a maul and sheer strength, and he seemed to carry half of the French pack with him.
See his number 1 McLaughlin. Ray McLaughlin, 1 yard from glory. Oh. Ray McLaughlin, Ireland's prop forward, has struck the vital blow at the right.
And there was something about Ray's defiance. He was the old man. He had been the strategist during the 60s, and here he was in the company of the youngsters, really putting it up to France.
Those are the men who've done Ireland proud.
I think we were in the lead for nearly all the match. I think probably all the match. So it just went well.
The whistle is gone, and Ireland has beaten France by 14 points to 9.
Tremendous feeling. And for us to win in Paris in '72 was amazing.
The whole idea of Willie John and Kiernan and Gibson being so pleased, just kind of for a reasonably young fella, got into your head, Jesus, we must have done something really special here. I suddenly got the message Ireland hadn't won there for 20 years.
When you win, you build confidence and you believe in yourself. And when you believe in yourself and you believe in the guys around you, it leads to other things.
The very fact that it was on television and that Ireland won and they beat France in Paris, wow.
It was a seminal moment in Irish rugby, and that suddenly everybody perked up and said, look, if we can take France in Paris, we can take anybody anywhere. And you really believed that that was going to happen.
The Masters on Sky Sports.
This is the moment.
Get Sky Sports for €20 a month for 6 months.
What a shot. What a shot. Oh, would you believe that? Rory McIlroy, what a round of golf.
And watch all 4 days exclusively live.
Oh, wow.
Scottish Heffron.
With an extraordinary result away to France in the bag, the team of 72's next fixture was in Twickenham against the old enemy.
Oh, the Irish-England game is always special, always, it's something that you want to beat them more than the other two.
The build-up was always more. It was more on the paper. There was more significant to the match because we're playing against England.
England in those days, once every 2 years, it was the biggest game, and especially when it was in Twickenham. So going there on the back of Paris, there was a bit of a buzz.
Twickenham was unlike everywhere else. The stands seemed to be a lot closer to the ground. It was like playing in a sardine tin. They were filled with the old enemy, right? There would have been a belief coming through from the crowd that they were cocksure they were going to win.
I don't think we were ever intimidated. They might have been better than us in some facets of the game. Just to win, to be successful, was all we needed.
We're in the dressing room in Twickenham and Tommy's given the team talk. When we run out on the pitch here, what I want you all to do is look up in the right-hand corner. And it's going to be about 500 Irish supporters there. That's the only place they'll be. This will be the one chance that you guys ever get to make them the day of their life.
Gibson then kicks off.
My first try would have come fairly early on. The ball came out. There was a bit of an overlap. I got a chance to go into the corner. I said to myself, if I don't make it here, Tom Kiernan will kill me. So I managed to get in there. And I turned round and gave me the old wink. And I said, I've done the job.
But as the full-time whistle drew close, Ireland were losing 12 points to 10, and the prospect of a first Grand Slam in 25 years was slipping away.
We trailed and it looked as if we weren't going to do anything. And the disappointment of hopes falsely raised by a once-off performance in Paris were beginning to materialise.
Ireland really stood up to England that day. We had some experienced backs. Kevin Flynn was in the centre.
Kevin came in for a short ball and then moved away. Barry McGann was a marvellous passer to the ball, put the ball straight in front of David Ducklin, and Kevin Flynn got in on the outside and scored under the post. I can still remember him gritting his teeth and doing that.
It was a magical moment for Irish rugby.
One of the great tries because it came so late in the game.
Happy days. Ireland win 16-12, and here we are. We've the hard bit done, lads. We now have Scotland and Wales at home. At the time, they weren't as strong as England and France, and we had them at home. Wow, you know, this is here for the picking.
your mad bastard!
1972 was the worst year in the Troubles in terms of fatalities. Of the 3,500 people who died during the Troubles, 500 of them died in 1972. From January to mid-February of 1972, including Bloody Sunday, over 40 people died in that 6-week period.
Bloody Sunday was an appalling, extraordinary moment in Irish history. It's not that there hadn't been attacks on civil rights marches previously, but the confluence of all of these things on a day in which the bloodlust of British soldiers was made real on the streets of Derry, in front of cameras, and then it was rebroadcast around the world, catapulted the Northern story and the wider Irish story to a whole new level.
Any half-civilized person must have felt sick as could be yesterday when they saw dead bodies lying around the place.
On the evening after Bloody Sunday, Monday evening, I was walking past the British Embassy. A couple of very weak attempts had been made to firebomb it. I thought I saw a little flame in the corner. There wasn't even police guard outside the embassy at this stage. I was free to walk right up to the door, and I remember kicking this very poor attempt at a firebomb, and it was flickering away, it wasn't doing any damage. And then a few hours later, a crowd assembled.
There was no way the forces of law and order could attempt to interfere because the crowd was so huge and so angry. And in fact, so angry that they stopped the fire brigade putting the fire out. And eventually it went up in flames and it burned. The reaction to Bloody Sunday was absolutely intense.
The immediate impact was not just the burning of that embassy, the burning of British-owned shops around the city. People who were targeted by the fact of their Englishness or Britishness.
It was a time of huge tension because the Troubles were only gaining a foothold in people's lives. People were only beginning to realise what was going on in the North.
Go into the newspapers day after day and read the stories of violence, read the threats of violence that are expressed time after time from all sides. There is no monopoly on virtue here. This is a society which is deeply unstable. It is a society which is pulling itself apart. It is a society in which people routinely say that civil war is a real prospect here.
Rugby had always tried to keep politics at arm's length, but the burning of Britain's embassy just a mile away from the home of Irish rugby at Lansdowne Road caused shock waves across the Five Nations.
There was rumours going around. People were asking us and so on, and we were asking them.
I saw it in the papers. There was some doubt about the Scotland team coming.
Unfortunately, the Scottish Rugby Union decided that they were not, for security reasons, coming to Dublin, and obviously that was a huge disappointment. The Scottish decision was kind of more or less saying Ireland, the island of Ireland, is not a safe destination any longer. The IRFU, on their part, they sent a delegation over to Edinburgh to try and persuade their Scottish counterparts to change their mind. The Jack Lynch government would have been back-channeling to the Ted Heath government, who was Prime Minister in the UK at the time, to try and ensure that the decision was reversed.
It didn't get very far, and they handed them a letter to say that they weren't coming.
I think they're probably basing it on the press comments on the situation in Ireland, and I would say they're probably being misled by a lot of them.
But if you step back from it, look at it from the one or two people in the hierarchy of Scottish rugby, they were judging things from what they probably saw on BBC News, and they were reading a British media slant on everything. If you look back, Scottish players over the years have said, nobody asked us. We would have gone.
I could not understand how they would allow sport to be mixed with politics.
Scotland's refusal to travel to Dublin, disregarding the wishes of their players, was unprecedented. And it put Ireland's next opponents in Dublin, Wales, in an almost impossible position.
A tremendous cheer for John Taylor. Taylor then.
We had a meeting at Aberavon where we used to train, and it was raised by the Welsh Rugby Union representatives there. And they took the view that we shouldn't be burdened with this and that they would take a decision. They did sort of sound us out, and virtually everybody wanted to go, no question. We had a hooker, Jeff Young, who was in the RAF. There was talk at the time of various people having received death threats from the IRA.
In desperation, the IRFU sent a 7-man delegation to Cardiff to persuade the Welsh to come. But the committee men said no.
We were absolutely furious because we felt we were on the right track for a second consecutive Grand Slam. I did feel the other bit of him that it was giving in to the IRA. I didn't want the IRA to have any reason to feel they had won even a psychological battle. I still thought that what would happen is it would be played at the beginning of the following season or something, but it never was.
I felt that as a sportsman you go and you fulfil your fixtures. Scotland and Wales didn't do that, and the shame is on them, really.
Let's be fair here. Scotland and Wales, these guys are amateurs. They had work on Monday morning, school teachers, bank clerks, solicitors, doctors. Their families were very worried about the situation in Ireland.
We were going to win the 2 matches in Dublin. There's no question or doubt about that. In 1970, I think we beat Wales 14-0. In those days, it was 3 points for a try. So, like, for Wales to beat us, they had a few tries to score. It didn't happen. So we would have beaten Wales and Scotland in 72. I'd sign my life on that.
Sort of felt we were leopards, we were ostracized, and we would think as long as this shooting and bombing continues, then we wouldn't be playing international rugby. I had been eased with security because I was managing a company up here. We were supplying builders who were building for the government, and they got threatened, and a couple of people were murdered. At that time, We were all stopping outside a shop and holding our hands up so they could search us. And it was quite surprising how, during that period, people just got so used to this way of life.
It was a huge letdown, probably more to us here in Ulster, and indeed right through all the provinces in Ireland, what we had put into the game to keep it going and try and keep it as normal as possible. It was a huge kick in the teeth to us.
What happened with that Scottish and subsequently Welsh decision, it took a team that really should be rated up there with 2009, 2018 Ireland teams and Mullen's team back in the 40s. It should be up there with them, but they don't have their silverware to prove it, so they're always going to be the team that didn't win a Grand Slam that should have.
The cancelled matches didn't just destroy Ireland's Grand Slam hopes, they would also endanger the survival of Irish rugby itself. Scotland and Wales had refused to travel to Dublin for their Five Nations matches, depriving Ireland of a possible Grand Slam. But the future of Irish rugby itself was also in danger.
The great cash cow in any given year for the Irish Rugby Football Union was the playing of 2 international matches as part of the Five Nations Championship, as it then was, in Dublin. As well as it being a great sporting occasion and a great social occasion, it was a huge economic occasion upon which the Irish Rugby Football Union depended for its income.
At that stage, the money was generated by the sale of tickets. And that was probably 80 or 90% of the income, whereas now it would be probably a lot less than that because you have television money, you have sponsors money and all. We didn't have any of that. Without the gate receipts, it's hard to see how they could have continued to exist.
I know for a fact that Wales gave a loan to the IRFU. It wasn't unanimously accepted by the committee of the IRFU, and one very senior committee man in the IRFU voted against accepting the money in the circumstance where they hadn't travelled to play the game.
The only thing that helped was the fact that to be fair to them, the French Rugby Union put up their hand and offered to play a game in Dublin in '72, and they came over and played the second international.
I think about 30,000 people turned up, and that money was enough to carry the IRFU over into the future.
On the Wednesday before the match, I dislocated my shoulder, so I couldn't play. So I rang up the IRFU and said, unfortunately I had to cry off, and the next thing I had to do was to go into Elvery's to buy a ticket to go and see the match.
Caps were not too plentiful in those days, so we were delighted to get another cap and delighted that the team played together and showed that it was no fluke that we beat them over there.
By December of 1972, bloodshed had come to Dublin in the form of bombings on Burgh Quay and Eden Quay. But the world's most feared rugby team, the All Blacks, were determined to show up for their game in Ireland.
The manager, he and the captain said, we'll play in the bog side if we have to.
It was a huge challenge. Ireland had never beaten the All Blacks, and the visitors had won every test of the tour so far.
It would have been intimidating. They had the haka, right? They had the name to be physically very strong. They were great rugby players. They were going for the Grand Slam, their Grand Slam, where they'd beat England, Wales, Scotland, and if they beat Ireland, they had the Grand Slam.
John Maloney then, going robbed him well.
New Zealand took an early lead with tries from Alex Wiley and Sid Going. With just seconds left to play, Ireland were trailing by 10 points to 6.
Suddenly we find ourselves scoring a try in the last minute.
Can he get there? Can he get there? The ball is dead, I think. It's a try. It's a try. Tommy Grace. And that's the situation. It couldn't be more tense.
The last kick of the game from Barry McGann on the sideline to win the match. Now, the kick was impossible. It was on McGann's wrong foot, on the wrong side of the pitch. Irish legend will always say it only barely missed, but the reality is it did just barely miss.
And that's it, I think. The referee calling things to a halt.
As Barry McGann would always say to me, right, that Grace, sir, you could have been famous if I got the kick, right? Because you were the man who scored the try, but unfortunately the wind took it to the right and we drew 10-all.
The men of Ireland have succeeded where no other country in the British Isles have succeeded.
During that match, you could actually hear this boom. Did you know what it was? Yeah, I had a really good idea what it was, just for that split second.
Everybody on the terrace looking around at each other, saying, what was that? And it sounded suspiciously like a bomb. And it turned out that, tragically, a man had lost his life in Sackville Place, just off O'Connell Street. A Scottish bus conductor working for CIE was the victim of a car bomb while the game was going on. The car had been hijacked in Belfast earlier that day and appears to have mixed in with all the traffic that would have been coming south for the match.
It added to the sense of crisis. We weren't quite sure who had done it. The southern state felt threatened. I think the southern political establishment felt threatened. There was always the fear that a massive Protestant backlash, a loyalist attack, with huge numbers killed, would destabilise both parts of Ireland.
The Five Nations match against England in Dublin was scheduled for just 3 weeks after the Sackville Place bomb. England were faced with a difficult decision: to stay away or to brave the unknown.
There was the big question mark: would England come, would they not come? And, you know, they had certainly very good reason not to come in view of what happened with Wales and Scotland, in view of the situation. It got no better, it got worse and worse as it went on.
So there was a year's speculation as to whether England would come. And during that year, obviously, the IRFU were hard at work diplomatically with their counterparts in England.
I would suspect that there was a lot of political input from the government to have them come. I would imagine the British Embassy was pretty busy in the weeks leading up to that, saying it's a very good idea you come.
I was just hopeful, you know, that they come, because just say they didn't come. And then Scotland and Wales probably wouldn't come the following year. We might have had no Five Nations for maybe a decade.
England's decision was made even more difficult by the historically close relations between English rugby and the British Armed Forces.
The empire was built in the schools. So the ethos of the public schools was taken into the regiment and taken into sport. Sportsmanship, the importance of captaincy.
What it was about was creating, in its own express words, a fellowship whereby people would play sport from different countries of the British Empire, and they would be drawn closer together by very virtue of playing sport against each other. The reality of sport, of course, is that it's rooted in competition. It is also about representation. Representing your club, representing your county, representing your country. Now, the minute you go to that idea of representing your country, you put it in a very particular frame of nationalism, and that transforms it. And it allows people to place badges and labels on you.
It was mainly the Air Force that got me into rugby. Well, being in the RAF, I was aware that things were not good, and there was an RAF station, Ballykelly, over there, and you know, we knew that there were problems, and security was pretty tight. And people were getting killed, weren't they?
The secretary of the Rugby Football Union addressed the whole squad and said, you know, the committee, which were all powerful in those days, have decided that we're going to Dublin. We're going to, the England team are going to go. Now, it's a personal decision. If you don't want to go, we'll understand that, and that, you know, it won't interfere with future selections. That's a personal decision.
We actually felt a little bit miffed by that in Wales because we felt we wanted to turn up but weren't allowed to. So that was sort of the reaction. But knowing the RFU as well as I know them over all the years, I'm not surprised that England actually went, because their attitude would have been, we're bigger than this and nobody will dare do anything to the game of rugby.
Because it was this old thing of, you know, the game is more important. The game is more important. Keep it alive.
Just played Wales, I think, on that weekend, and the selectors sat down and they talked it through, and well, I got the impression they were going anyhow, they'd prefer it if I went as captain. And they said it'd make it easier and maybe more people would play, but if I didn't, then they were still going. That was the impression I got. So it was take it or leave it, really. Before the match, there wasn't. I did have one threatening phone call. Just told me not to go. He said, if I was you, don't go to Ireland. I never actually told anyone about it at the time, and whether it was someone putting on an Irish accent or not, I don't know. I never will know.
Oh, wow. Well, I wasn't aware of that, actually.
To take that burden, not share it with anybody, and just go on and lead his country, that shows you the kind of man we're dealing with.
Oof. Well, I mean, I didn't know about this, and I think that must have been a pretty scary thing.
I didn't know that. But he went anyway. Yeah. Good for him. Good for him.
The master.
In 1972, the Five Nations had been disrupted by bombings and mayhem. The following year, against a background of worsening violence that had spread south of the border, the English RFU left the decision to travel to Dublin to the English players themselves.
David Duckham would have been sort of the star of the England team, and his opinion would have been very important. And I believe Willie John had a word with him, and you don't say no to Willie John.
Duckham phoned me and he said, look, he said, Willie, he says, I've got married fairly recently, and he said, Gina's not very happy that I should go to Dublin. And I said, the first name that's on that sheet every day is David Duckham. And I said, if you cry off, David, it's gone. And I said, you could never live with that. I said, oh, I never thought of that. And I said, well, those are the facts. And I says, tell Jean to come over, and my wife will look after her, and the Irish ladies' wives will look after her in Dublin. Now, that was never heard of before, because women didn't count, wives didn't count in the rugby. They were never talked about. You weren't married. This has nothing to do with us. And I said, if you bring her over, we'll look after her. And he says, right, I'll go and talk to her again. And he came back to me and he said, right, it's on. If Tuckman had cried off, it was gone. I knew that.
These were other rugby players, right? You weren't being paid for it. It was a hobby. So were you going to put your life in danger? You needed somebody like Willie John to stand up and bang his chest like this and say, I look after you.
Even a threatening phone call couldn't persuade Captain John Pullen to give up his place in the team.
I knew that England would have gone with whatever team that would say that they were available. And being a bit selfish, I didn't want anyone else to be playing hooker for England. So I said yes, I would go and be captain.
And I had a young family in '73, and so I decided that it wasn't worth the risk for me, being in the military as well. So felt it could have been a target. That was the decision I made, and you know I was happy with it at the time.
The England team for the game contained a number of new caps, including lock Roger Utley and hooker Fran Cotton.
I was a single bloke. I loved playing. It was a opportunity to play against Ireland. I never even thought about the troubles or the risks that may be involved.
John Elders had just on his way back from a selection meeting down south, you know, so he had a really long day. He said, well, just to let you know, you're playing in Dublin in a fortnight's time. I said, oh, that's great. And then he just got back in his car and went off. And I went back inside to the room, and Chrissy said, you don't look very well. I said, it's going to be in Dublin in a fortnight's time against Willie John McBride.
Security in Dublin was tight. In the 2 weeks leading up to the game, the Troubles had claimed 26 victims.
When we got to Dublin and flew in, instead of pulling up at the main terminal, we were sort of shipped off to the side in the hangar, and we looked out the window, and there's a couple of buses there, but surrounded by Garda, Garda vehicles, and Garda with machine guns strapped across the chest. You're thinking, oh, well, this is obviously a bit different.
I remember David Dugan saying to me, they had been told when we had arrived at the gate they would be picked up in a non-marked bus and all sorts of things. He said when we arrived and we got out and we got onto this coach, and he said right up the side of it was English RFU. He says right across the whole bus. He said we were sitting ducks if there were anything.
So they had that kind of gallows humour. They were in the bus on the way to the Shelbourne, and they were playing musical chairs, so a sniper couldn't get them, you know what I mean? So none of them could get to going, oh, they might be going for you because they think the captain's sitting there, so they were moving seats.
The thing I remember was arriving at the Shelbourne Hotel, and it was a little bit like going into airports these days, where there's a lot of security and so forth.
The Irish team and the English team stayed in the same hotel, which you never did before. You always stayed in separate hotels across the city. It did bring it home to you when you got there. There were armed police on the bottom of every staircase outside the rooms, and then it's suddenly dawned on me that perhaps things were a bit more serious than I'd anticipated.
When you turned up in Lansdowne Road and the place was jam-packed, I'd say they were shaking. Just the thought of it, like, we're in the middle of this place. Do these guys, these 60,000 people, do they have guns with them, you know?
There was a lot of atmosphere, and I'm in the changing room looking around and thinking, oh, this is a bit scary. JV's getting us all together and saying, right, well, we've come this far, let's go and do what we're supposed to do.
Well, before we ran on, I had no idea what the reception was going to be.
And John Pullen, England's captain, any second will appear through that throng of Garda.
The English team went out on the pitch, and we were to follow them maybe 15 seconds later.
What a reception you get. This is what we've waited for 2 years.
I'll never forget, as long as I live, the applause from the Lansdowne Road crowd. It was just fantastic. It seemed to go on forever.
I've just got goosepimples. Just an unforgettable, absolutely unforgettable moment when John Pullen led the English team out onto the pitch.
Not one person not on his feet in this ground. This is tremendous.
It's I'm almost emotional thinking about it. How Irish rugby people in the ground that day reacted to England coming onto the pitch.
There was a man called Frank Whisker. He would have been chief steward. His job was to make sure that both teams got out safely onto the pitch. And to Frank's eternal credit, realised, very, very quick thinking, what was happening. That England were getting a standing ovation and it was going on. So he stopped us going on the pitch. Now, we were there for about 4 minutes while the crowd were clapping.
We could hear it all, you see, it was unbelievable. And it went on and on and on. And, you know, we were saying, you know, let's get at them.
We'd be like a bunch of cattle trying to get out of a pen, you know, not yet.
And then, of course, there was an even bigger roar. It was just a magical moment, not just in sport, but to my mind, in just simple humanity.
Before or since, I've never experienced anything quite like it. It was spontaneous, I think, just the recognition that this was so important and the appreciation that England had turned up.
What the English did was courageous, practically courageous, but morally extremely courageous. And on the back of that, I believe it enhanced the game of rugby union on this island and in these islands more than ever. And certainly for me, it had a very huge impact on me as one of whatever number were in the ground that day.
It put all of the things there, the tragedy and the violence and the horrific things that were happening in the country at the time, it put them to one side for that moment, and you know, and the whole point was you're safe playing sport.
I don't think, you know, for diplomatic and sensible reasons, that there were any anthems. We just got straight on with the game. And of course, once the ball is up in the air and you're just having to focus on that, and wonder whether or not you're going to get mullered by some big bloke in a green shirt.
Gibson's with him. There's a gap there. Beautiful ball, Tom Grace.
We were an emerging team. There were a lot of new players in the team. Ireland had an established team and a lot of really great players. We did okay, but they were the better team on the day. At no stage would you say we deserved to win it or could have won it.
I must admit, when we were playing, you got that sort of feeling you were looking round, seeing what was happening on top of the stand or something, not that you could have done anything about it. And it must have been a lot worse for the wingers, because they were started on their own all afternoon, weren't they? At least half the time I was in the scrum out of the way. So I think nerves did get to quite a few of them, and we didn't play that well. We were forward-wise, we didn't dominate. Ken Kennedy was doing his usual tricks of scrabbling around on the floor, annoyed me.
That feeling was there that, you know, Ireland have to win today.
Line out, and Ireland take possession again.
Johnny was just himself. He was just sniping all over the place. And he just had that extraordinary ability at scrum half to create space for others and then to offload, because he was a very intelligent player as well.
Another penalty kick by McGann sends the score to 18 for Ireland, England 9. A great day for the Irish.
I remember talking to Tony Neary, and like, Tony could have played for Ireland and he captained England later on, and he said to me afterwards, Jesus, so much for the Cane Meal of Falcha, and you kicked the ass out of us.
We did seem to relax after the game. The atmosphere had been good in the game, or the crowd. You did realise that you had done something special, as it were. And it did mean a lot to the Irish people in the crowd, the fact that rugby had been played again, and other teams really had no excuse for not coming again. So I was very glad that I did go.
It was great in those days because we did have a formal dinner after every game. And you pretty well sat opposite your opposite number in tables, you know, which was great. So you got to know the guys well.
You get changed and put the dinner jacket on, all that rubbish. And I would always scribble down a few notes because you always had to make a speech at the dinner.
We'd no idea what he was going to say, but being a farmer from Gloucestershire, he was a man of few words. And of course then when he came out with that line, it just, everybody stood up and applauded. It was the perfect line. Yeah, if he'd have had his own script writer, couldn't have written that better and saying, look, we may not be very good, but at least we turn up.
It went down very well. They loved it. And they all had a clap and a cheer, which gave you time to look down at your notes, see what the next line was. I didn't expect it to have quite the effect it did, but it seemed to live on and have a life of its own, that line, as it were.
You know, when you think of Neil Armstrong's greatest thing, in a rugby context, that to me, that was equivalent when he stood up or he finished off his thing. We may not be a great team, but at least we turn up. To me, that was incredible. It summed up the whole situation. It summed up England. It summed up rugby.
It did mean a lot to them, and they were, you know, really glad that we were there. Apart from the fact they beat us in the game, which spoiled things. So, although if we'd won, I couldn't have said that line, could I? So perhaps it's as well we lost.
The decision for England to come was so important. Not alone for that match, but for the next 10 years. I have so much time for England. If I hear people running down England in a rugby context, I will go mad. They are our friends.
It brought normality back to our game that had been taken away from us. It was very, very important.
How much did it mean to Irish rugby? Oh, I don't know that we could have ever repaid them for it.
As long as the fellas still live, and even after we're all gone, it'll never be forgotten. Because on that day, they probably saved the future of Irish rugby.